Let's start out with prayer this morning. Would you join me? Heavenly Father, we just thank you that we can come to your house this morning to worship you and show you how much we love you, Lord, and to learn more about you and what your word has for us this morning. So I ask you to bless all the words today, that it be according to your will, and open hearts to hear what you have to say to each one of us. And we ask this in Jesus' precious name. Amen. Well, greetings. You know, I still feel unworthy at all the attention that I'm getting for sharing this story. And I understand it was a remarkable thing that happened to me. It was a privilege. But I take no credit for it. It was an act of compassion or courage. I wish it had been. The truth of it is, I resisted it. I wanted nothing to do with it. As far as I was concerned, I was at the wrong place at the wrong time. Now I know different. Now I know it was God who put me on that very road at that very moment. If it hadn't been for that seemingly random encounter, I would never have carried the cross for Christ. And after what happened to me that day, I have to come to believe that there are no random encounters. Rather, God is always at work, leading us to times and places where we might meet him. In fact, you being here today could just be such an occurrence. So let me tell you my story. I've written it all down so I don't forget any details. I'm not a public speaker. My name is Simon. I'm a Jew by birth, but my family left Judea when I was very young. We settled in the region of Cyrene in northern Africa, and I was raised in a Jewish community there. Though we were far from our homeland, it was a close-knit community. Mine was a very devout household. Every Sabbath, we went to synagogue. From the age of 12, my father taught me the Torah. We observed all the holy days, and like every Jewish boy, I dreamed that one day I would celebrate the Passover in Jerusalem. I grew up to be what you might call a religious man. You know the kind I mean, devout, respectable, faithful, but not very much fun to be around. Hey, do you know Simon? Someone might ask. Oh, yes, Simon, they'd say. A very fine man. Very religious. Then they change the subject. Well, that's how it is when you're religious. People don't really know what to do with you, and they kind of keep a safe distance. I soon married, and I had 2 fine sons. I found honorable work that proved a good living and was well thought of in my community. But in the middle years, I found myself increasingly dissatisfied with my life, particularly my religion. My beliefs and practices gave structure to my life, but somehow they never satisfied my deep longing for joy, peace, and a nearness to God. I continued to keep all the laws and the customs of my people. How could I not after all those years? But they held less and less meaning for me. Now take Passover, for instance. It celebrates the greatest event in the history of my people, our deliverance from Egypt. You know the story. Pharaoh hardened his heart again and again and would not allow the Hebrews to leave. God sent an angel of death through the land, taking the life of every firstborn male. But a provision had been made for the people of Israel. Every household was required to slaughter a lamb and place the blood of that lamb on the door frames of their houses. They were to put the blood on the sides and blood on the top of the door frame. When the angel of death passed through the land, it passed over the houses with the blood, and they were spared. Pharaoh finally relented, and our people went free. Every year, for thousands of years, our people have remembered that event with 7 days of feasting and ceremonies. Every household offers a sacrificial lamb. But over time, I started to wonder, why? What does it mean for us this many years later? These traditions gave shape to my life, but my soul wasn't satisfied. Have you ever found that to be the way in your religion? So, a year or so ago, I had to travel to Jerusalem to conduct some business over several weeks. But I was determined to make it more than just a business trip. As it turned out, I was going to be there for the Passover. Maybe in the Holy Land, in the holy city, at the holy time of year, I would finally discover what was missing in my experience with religion. I was tired of going through the motions. Maybe in Jerusalem, my religion would at last become real to me. Maybe then I could live my faith with my whole heart. If nothing happened over time in Jerusalem, I felt like I would just have to give up the whole thing. I had no family in the city, but when I arrived, I found some Cyrenian Jews in town too for the feast. Oh, it was a thrill to join the thousands of pilgrims at the temple and to watch as our sacrifice was offered, the smoke rising to the heavens. The words of the priest were familiar and comforting. It was a beautiful ceremony. It truly was. But it did nothing for me. Here I was at the temple, at the highest, holiest time of the year, but I felt no closer to God. That was my problem. Religion wasn't enough. I wanted God. I wanted to know him. Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, these people knew God. Moses met God in the desert through a burning bush. David wrote about walking with God through green pastures and the valley of death. That's what I wanted. I wanted a God that I could talk to, a God who would meet me, a God who would walk with me. But if I couldn't find him in Jerusalem at Passover, when and where? So as it turned out, my work took me out of the city for a couple of days, out to the country. But I had arranged to be back in time for the end of the feast. My negotiations took longer than expected. Oh, don't they always? So I found myself hurrying in from the country on the very eve of the Sabbath. I was still hopeful I would find my answer before the Passover ended. Soon the walls of the city and the temple came into view. I felt this surge of pride that every Jew feels at the sight of Mount Sinai. But as I came to the top of the rise of the road, something sent a chill down my spine. On the crest of the hill, just off to the side of the road, some soldiers were at work. They were digging holes, laying out timbers and ropes, and beside them was a pile of spikes. It was the hill that the locals call Golgotha, the place of the skull. It was clear that they were preparing for a crucifixion. The mere mention of the word crucifixion makes us cringe. We are all familiar with that barbaric form of execution. We know too well how the Romans have used it to terrorize us and keep us in check. And for those of us who are Jews, it is all the more horrible because we know the death on a tree signals judgment from God. I hurried past, not wanting to look or imagine the poor souls that would be there tortured that day. I was more determined than ever to reach the city, and I quickened my pace. But rounding a bend in the road, I came upon a small band of soldiers that were being followed by a wailing band of mourners. In a moment, it was clear these folk were the criminals. They were on their way to their crucifixion. And you know how it works. The condemned man is forced to carry the crosspiece on which he will die. There were 3 men that day, each one surrounded by a quadrant of soldiers. One was carrying a sign with the charges against the prisoner. Oh, I cursed my bad luck. Why did I have to be on the road at this moment and happen upon this awful sight? I had no choice but to pass by them. I moved as far as I could to the side of the road, and I hurried past. The first 2 apparently were thieves. They were cursing their crosses as the soldiers prodded them on. I wasn't sure who I despised more, the criminals or the tormentors. Just wanted to get past them as quickly as possible. The third group was falling behind the first 2, and as I got closer, I could read the words written about him. This is Jesus. The sign read, King of the Jews. Jesus. I recognized that name. I'd heard them talk about him in Jerusalem. He was a rabbi from Galilee, apparently, but he was no ordinary rabbi. Some said he performed signs and wonders, and others called him a prophet. He had quite a following among the common people, but the religious leaders called him a troublemaker. Could this man be that Jesus? But why would the Romans crucify a rabbi? Again, I moved to the side of the road, and I tried to hurry past. And as I did, there was this sudden scuffle. Jesus collapsed under the weight of the beam. The soldiers were kicking and cursing him, but he clearly had no strength to go on. For just a moment, I actually considered helping the man, but I quickly thought better of that. He's a criminal, after all, and these soldiers were hardened, angry men. The best thing I could do was just get out of there as quickly as possible. I was almost past them when I felt the weight of a sword press against my shoulder, a moment every Jew dreads. Now remember, we are subject people living in an occupied country. Any Roman soldier has the right to impress any Jew into his service. If he is tired of carrying his coat, he tells you to carry it for them, and you must, for a whole mile. It's the law. Well, I was not interested in carrying anyone's coat that day, so I pretended not to notice, and I continued on my way. But the soldier pressed harder with his sword, knocking me to the ground. What did he want with me? I didn't do anything. Another step or 2, and I would have been out of his reach. You, carry his cross, the soldier said. What did he say? I thought. Carry his cross? Oh, no. Anything but that. I want nothing to do with this man's cross, or this man himself, or this whole scene. I don't belong to people like this. I'm just a businessman. I'm on my way to a holiday. But these soldiers were in no mood for a hard time. So I hoisted the wooden beam, rested it across my shoulders, and began walking toward Golgotha. Again, I cursed my bad luck. If only I had taken a different road. If only I'd left a few minutes earlier. If only a number of things had or hadn't happened, and I would have never run into this mess, this Jesus. But it was too late for all that now. All that was left was to get it over with. As soon as we reached the hill, I could drop that cross and get out of there. I knew if I hurried, I could still make it into the city before nightfall and meet up with my friends for dinner. Glancing sideways, I got a good look at this condemned man It was obvious he had already suffered a great deal. The robe on his back was soaked with blood, as if he'd been whipped. His face was puffy and bruised. The blood oozed from a circle of wounds around his head. As I labored under the weight of the cross, I wondered, how had he carried it this far in his condition? He didn't speak. But at one point, our eyes met. I expected to see anger or defiance, what I had seen in the other condemned men. Instead, I saw gratitude. I also saw a sense of certainty in his eyes, as if he'd been expecting me. And while he must have been in great pain, there was no defeat in his eyes. Instead, courage. There was a resolve that I could not understand. It was as if he was determined to do this. Who was this man? What had he done to deserve death by crucifixion? And we settled into a strange rhythm, he and I, as if we were in this together. When we arrived at Golgotha, the soldiers were already at work on the other two crosses. With grim efficiency, they set about their task. The wooden beams were laid out on the ground. The victims were forced onto their backs. The victims' arms were stretched and held down while a soldier pounded a stake through their hands. The men cursed and screamed with each blow, but the executioners didn't flinch. The soldiers directed me to the center space, and they told me, drop the cross there. When I let it go, my body rose involuntarily. I lost my balance. You're free to go, said the centurion. But I wasn't. For some reason, I just couldn't leave Jesus. After carrying his cross all that way, walking beside him, exchanging glances, I felt like I knew him, and he knew me. Within moments, they had nailed him to the crosspiece, though I heard no cries or cursing. Quickly, they raised the cross up from the ground, and then the worst moment came. They dropped it into place in a hole, and all his weight came to rest on his nail-pierced hands and feet. You could hear the flesh tear, and his shoulders pop as they were pulled from their sockets. A great rush of air escaped his lungs, and from that moment on, he was gasping for breath. Blood began to run from his hands and his feet, and the color quickly drained from his face. A crowd had gathered by that time. I thought to myself, what kind of twisted curiosity would attract people to such a scene as this? But these people weren't just watching. They were mocking him. Not the other two victims, just Jesus. They were laughing at him. They were calling down curses on him. What had he done that they should despise him so? He clearly wasn't like the other men. They were as foul-mouthed and hateful as their tormentors. But all the while, Jesus was calm and controlled. No matter what they did, he didn't retaliate. If anything, there was kindness in his eyes. And when he did speak, it was not what you would expect to hear. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Forgive them? Forgive who? Forgive the soldiers? The crowd? All of us standing by silently in the face of such wickedness and injustice? And who was he to call God his Father? Gradually, the crowd dispersed. and the hill grew quiet. The only sound was the labored breathing of the dying men and the bickering of the soldiers as they gambled for the men's belongings. And soon darkness descended, even though it was in the middle of the day. Suddenly, Jesus shouted out, "My God! My God! Why have you forsaken me?" For the first time, he seemed to be losing control, as if the anguish of it all had overtaken him. And still, he was talking to God. It was as if something was happening between the two of them, something deep, powerful. About 3 hours of darkness. There were only a few of us left. Some women were there. One man who appeared to be one of Jesus' followers. All afternoon, I studied the sign above his head. This is Jesus. The name means Savior. But what kind of Savior was he? Who was he saving by dying on a cross? And then there was the rest of the title, King of the Jews. I'm a Jew. Was this my king? I thought to myself, I would be honored to have such a man for my king. Jesus had been quiet for some time, and then he spoke again. It was as if he was on some sort of a mission. And after he spoke, we watched him closely. Many minutes passed, and he stopped breathing and died. And he did so calmly, as if he meant to. As sundown approached and the Sabbath drew near, I wondered who would take his body down. I had heard that he had a large following and a small band of disciples. Well, where were they all? Finally, a couple of older men came, and with the help of some women, they lowered his limp body, wrapped it in cloths, and carried it away. And it was over. But I couldn't leave. Something had happened on that hill. I wasn't sure what. A few hours before, I had never met Jesus. I'd only heard of him, but having carried his cross, having watched him die, I was sure I could just never forget him. Before leaving the hill, I turned to look one more time at that cross, and what I saw took my breath away. His body was gone, but the blood stains remained. There was blood on the ends of the crosspiece where his hands had been nailed, and more blood on the upright where his bloodied head had rested. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. There was blood on the sides and blood on the top, just like the blood my ancestors put on their door frames that first Passover, to assure that the death descended on the land of Egypt, the people of God were spared by the blood of the Lamb. Something had happened on that hill. We had been passed over. Death had come to that hill, the judgment of God, and it had fallen on Jesus. And we had been passed over. This wasn't some religious ceremony. This was real. This was powerful. This was holy ground. Like Moses and the burning bush, I took off my sandals. God was speaking to me, and I spoke back. There was no priest present. There were no ceremonial words spoken. I just talked to God, just as Jesus had done. I thanked him for bringing me to this place. I thanked him for allowing me to meet Jesus. And I asked his forgiveness for my lack of faith. And I asked him to show me more so that I could know him better. I told him, I would take up that cross and I would carry it every day if it meant I could be closer to Jesus. My friends, I no longer believe in chance encounters or random events. God is always at work, leading us to times and places where we might need him. And that was my time and my place, the road to Golgotha on the day Christ died. Who knows? This may be your time and your place. Maybe you sense that God really led you here this morning, and he is speaking to you. Hear him. Maybe you are a religious person like I was, but you're still searching for a faith that's real. Maybe in this moment you sense God drawing near to you, speaking to you. Hear him. Look to the cross, as I did. Talk to God. Bring him your questions. Ask him to show you the truth about Jesus. And for those of you who are like me, those of you who are already followers of Jesus, thank God for leading you to him. And join me in telling your story to anyone who will listen. And when in the course of your journey through life, you come upon something that looks like a cross, something heavy, something hard to carry, something that challenges your faith and tests your strength, pick it up and carry it. It will lead you to holy ground, and it will lead you closer to Christ. So now, it's your turn. Keep the story going. You tell as many as you can the story of Jesus, the Christ, and listen for God's voice and hear him. And remember, it's like what I said earlier. God is always at work, leading us to times and places where we might meet him. In fact, your being here today could be such an occurrence. Thank you for letting me tell my story, and God bless.